We had Macron, who said he was going to commit soldiers to the theatre of war in Ukraine. He's just come back from there. What is going on, Marcus? Does there seem to be any prospect whatever of Macron and Starmer influencing Donald Trump?
Let me say this. If Britain had a free and independent media, the following questions would be put to the British government. Firstly, articulate the claim with tangible evidence that Russia poses a direct threat to British national security. Because saying that Russia poses a threat to Britain on the basis of Russia having invaded Ukraine is a simple-minded and untenable argument. After all, history teaches us that many wars have broken out because of provocation. Namely, one country has felt threatened by the actions of another country on its borders and has resorted to military action. Secondly, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who couldn't budget for a picnic, let alone a country, and someone who is simply a puppet, as is Starmer and Lammy, said late last year that there is no money for winter fuel allowance for pensioners. However, now the government has found money to increase British military defence spending. Well, why didn't Reeves find that money late last year for pensioners in Britain so that they do not freeze to death? Also, why doesn't Reeves find the money to help British people with the never-ending increase in the cost of living, for example, energy? And thirdly, if the British government is sincere when it says it will protect Britain's national security, then why doesn't Starmer deploy the Royal Navy to the English Channel to intercept men of military age who are illegal immigrants coming across the English Channel and into Britain? Why doesn't Starmer deploy the British Army to the beaches around Dover to intercept men of military age who are coming to this country illegally? Why doesn't Starmer give the order to the police in Britain to arrest each and every illegal immigrant? After all, they have entered Britain illegally, therefore they have committed a crime. Now, turning to the war in Ukraine, when Russia and America conduct high-level relations, negotiations with each other, most people in the world, including politicians and journalists, simply cannot understand this level of negotiations between the White House and the Kremlin. Often what happens, Lembit, is this. When the Russians and the Americans conduct high-level relations with each other, they put out information which is nothing more than a red herring or theatre, so that it distracts people, so that the Russians and the Americans can continue agreeing on what they are actually agreeing on and come into a conclusion on what they are actually coming to a conclusion on. The British government, or to be more precise, the British establishment, doesn't know how to deal with Donald Trump. The British government is aware that Donald Trump is not entirely in charge of America. Why? Because the deep state remains entrenched in America. After all, Trump has only been back in the White House for a few weeks. But still, the British government is confused about how to deal with Trump. The British government wants to continue the war against Russia because it is a proxy war against Russia. The British establishment historically has only hatred for Russia and the Russian people. That is an irrefutable historical fact. So when Trump meets with Starmer, he will not be meeting with Starmer per se. because Trump knows that Starmer is merely a puppet of the British establishment. Trump, when he meets with Starmer, will effectively be meeting with the British establishment. No different to how when Trump met with Macron last week, he met with the French establishment. So clearly, the globalists in power in Europe are trying to keep the war going in Ukraine in order to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. They are also now attempting to derail the attempts by the Trump administration to bring peace to Ukraine. Because let's be very clear about it. The British establishment, the French establishment, the German establishment, and indeed the American establishment despise Trump and his administration, because the Trump administration is trying to end that war in Ukraine and is trying to build a new relationship with Russia. That is not what the deep state wants, or what I call the Western ruling elites.
That's an extraordinarily erudite and concise summary of what seems to be happening. Essentially, you're saying that Starmer and Macron don't matter. It's the establishment behind them that matters. They're just puppets. And Trump is trying to reestablish a relationship between those two superpowers in the interest of America. And I suppose Putin is doing the same. If that's correct, then what's the point of Starmer even going to the USA when Russia has 2.5 million personnel, give or take, in its military? China has over 2 million. And Britain has 76,000.
The British establishment understand the importance of PR. They understand that it is absolutely necessary for the puppet Starmer or the puppet Lammy to maintain the preposterous notion that Britain is the defender of democracy and freedom and civilization in the world. So the puppet Starmer has to keep on making the argument that Russia is a threat to Britain, that Russia is a threat to democracy, that Russia is a threat to freedom. And therefore, this has to be backed up by Starmer going to America. It is simply PR. Trump understands how this works. There are certain niceties when it comes to diplomatic relations. And after all, Britain and America have been strategic allies and friends for many years now. So that is why Trump will meet with Starmer. But what is going on at the moment is far more important than any meeting between Trump and Starmer. What is going on at the moment are serious and severe talks behind the scenes between the elite of the elite in the American establishment and the elite of the elite in the British establishment. They are trying to work out how to deal with Trump. Trump will only be successful in his quest to save America and in his quest to end the war in Ukraine and to build a new relationship with Russia only by purging each and every institution in America, because every aspect of life in America has been taken over by what Trump calls the deep state, or what I would call the American establishment or the American ruling elite. So Trump, as it stands, is hamstrung. On the one hand, he's trying to bring peace to Ukraine. But on the other hand, he's having to contend with the deep state in America and the deep state in Britain. That is a formidable threat which he is faced with. But he has appointed hard-hitting men to his cabinet. And let me be clear again, hard-hitting men who are fierce patriots and who are masculine, unlike for the imbeciles in the French government or in the British government. Also, Trump has tens of millions of Americans backing him. So Trump is up against a formidable combination of the American deep state and the British deep state. Could he fail to save America? Could he fail to bring peace to Ukraine? Yes, he could. But on the other hand, I truly believe that after the American establishment attempted to assassinate him, after the American establishment attempted to send him to prison, I truly believe that Trump wants a fight to the death. So the American establishment and the British establishment are in trouble.
Fascinating. I want to come back to two things after the break. One is a weird statement by the Danish Prime Minister that peace may be more dangerous than war, which is straight out of the George Orwell copybook on Big Brother. And the second one is whether there's any point in Starmer getting on the plane at all to go to America. You're watching Marcus Papadopoulos and me, Len Topic, here on the Pulse.today as we try to work out the strange shenanigans which lead Keir Starmer to think that it's worth going to see Donald Trump. See you in a minute. We'll be talking about CO2 and electric vehicles in the second hour. For now, we're talking about the hot air generated by the British Parliament, particularly Keir Starmer, who is planning to go and tell Donald Trump what he has to do to get peace in Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that Starmer and the British establishment and the French have had 3 years to do it, but they only got going once Trump got elected. Now, a couple of things, Marcus. The Danish Prime Minister has said, Mette Frederiksen, I think is her name, she said that peace in Ukraine may be more dangerous than war. Now, her whole quote is, I understand that many people believe that a peaceful solution or a ceasefire is a good idea, but we risk that peace in Ukraine is actually more dangerous than the war that is going on now. That's what she said. What does she mean?
Well, if I was a journalist before her, I would ask her this. Articulate that claim that peace is more dangerous than war. I would press her on the point, and I would say, whatever you're going to say, support it with concrete evidence that a legitimate court of law would entertain. But of course, she wouldn't answer that question. It is simply nonsense. And worse still, it is inversion at its most inverted. All that we see happening in the Western world is inversion. So if you believe in the preservation of your culture, you are racist. If you believe that men should not be allowed to go into women's safe spaces, then you are sexist. If you believe that peace should trump war, then you are a threat. Then you are dangerous. This is how twisted, this is how diabolical the Western ruling elites or globalists and their puppets are. The Danish Prime Minister has been put in that position not based on merit, but based on her gender. Because, of course, this is another aspect of the war which the globalists are waging against the Western nations, whereby they are saying that men are toxic, that men are aggressive, that men are warmongers. So what have we seen this week in Britain? The portrait of Lord Nelson, one of the finest naval commanders in human history, has been replaced with a portrait of Yvette Cooper. Why? Because they are saying that Nelson represents a period of sexism. And today's Britain is all about tolerance. What preposterous nonsense. Cooper, like Starmer, like Badenoch, like Lammy, like Rayner, are the dregs of society. They are yes men or they are yes women. The very fact that Nelson's portrait has been taken down in the first place, and worse still, replaced by a portrait of Yvette Cooper, is absolutely deplorable. It is absolutely unforgivable. But again, that is another form of inversion. The reality is this: we must support peace. even if you despise Putin, and I don't know where people's opinions of Putin have come from, though I strongly suspect it's based on Western mainstream media, but still, even if you despise Putin, the most important thing is to try and bring about peace. Stop the carnage. Stop young men and women in Ukraine being rounded up by the Ukrainian secret police, the SBU, and being forced into the army. Stop the deaths of soldiers on both sides and civilians in Ukraine. What is more important than that? But again, Lembit, if there is a Russian threat to Europe, then whoever is making that claim must articulate it. They must support it with tangible evidence. Don't say that Putin is evil. Don't say that Russia is tyranny. That's irrelevant, and that's not an argument. I want to hear specific details based on tangible evidence that Russia threatens Europe.
This is a strange thing. You're talking, of course, about the change in art, with Yvette Cooper and others saying in Westminster, saying that they have to reflect greater diversity, all founded, as far as I can see, in this terrible organization, Black Lives Matter, who were allowed to freely demonstrate and break rules while those objecting to the COVID scam were arrested. And so you've got not just Admiral Nelson, you also had Francis Drake, I think, picture of him taken down, as you mentioned, Winston Churchill. It's the emasculation of our political system and the demonization of white, straight men who apparently owe some kind of an apology to the extent where they can't be displayed on walls. I wonder if, when you add all this together, this is why we're seeing such a weak-willed prime minister who doesn't know what he's doing, wants to perpetuate war, but obviously is now trying to kowtow to Donald Trump, who clearly is unreconstructed and not emasculated in America.
British mainstream politicians and British mainstream journalists talk about the importance of diversity. What about diversity of opinion? What about a different opinion on BLM or LGBTQ or the reasons for the war in Russia? That falls under the category of diversity. But of course, they have no tolerance of diversity of opinion. These people at Westminster or in Whitehall, or who comprise British mainstream media, have no regard for democracy. They have no regard for freedom. Indeed, they have no regard for the cultural and spiritual identity of the British people. That is why they spit on, indeed urinate on, the British national identity. We hear about BLM. Well, BLM did even more than what you said, Lembit, in America. They set towns and cities on fire. They destroyed people's businesses. They cost the American taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. They ransacked churches. They desecrated Bibles. And yet we are told by the American establishment and the British establishment that we should take a knee to this nefarious movement. Why? Again, the people who are waging this war on the nations of the Western world hate us. They want to destroy our culture, our religion, Christianity. They want to destroy our history. They want to destroy our heritage. They want to humiliate us. And we should also be aware, Lembit, that many of the indignities that our culture, for example, in Britain, is encountering constitutes ritual humiliation. Again, these people who are doing this to us despise us. So these are very dangerous times for us.
Zips agrees with you. He says more than that lamb chop, or I'll forgive you for the lamb chop. They're trying to eradicate the history that they've fed us for the last few hundred years, year zero, trying to zero everything, including us. And Truthful Out says it's all about the old colonial weapon of division and conquer. now by the neo-colonial liberals who are useful idiots of the global elites. So quite a lot of support in my non-scientific sample, I have to say, here on the chat. After the break, I want to proceed to a practical analysis of the true status of the United Kingdom on the world stage and what, if anything, might be achieved by Keir Starmer's flight. He's in the sky right now. Flight to America to meet Donald Trump again. All of that with me, Len Topic, here on the Pulse today.
Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
For The Pulse, this is James O'Neill. The U.S. House of Representatives narrowly passed House Speaker Mike Johnson's budget resolution in a 217 to 215 vote, setting the stage for a massive spending and tax reform package aligned with President Donald Trump's agenda. Australian Security Intelligence Organization Director General Mike Burgess condemned an alleged attempt by News Corp journalists to provoke anti-Semitic remarks at a Middle Eastern restaurant in Sydney, calling it mind-blowingly stupid.
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Lighting the fuse for freedom. Today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Gogsky says Tobias Elwood, who's a Conservative MP, wants UK conscription back now. People really seem to think war is a computer game, says Vinny. As our grandparents die off, they really are unaware. That's why you see brainwashed gamers going to fight for Kiev and return in a body bag. Eileen agrees. Little Carol says, hello, lovely friends. Hello, Little Carol. You come to the right place. Doster Bloke says, the best way to upset the so-called progressive Western politicians is to advance the cause of peace. I want to talk about this now, Marcus. What is the point of Keir Starmer going to see Donald Trump? You said that he's a puppet for the elites here to address the elites in the States, but I don't get the feeling that Trump, although hampered by the traditional elites, that Trump is part of that elite malaise.
Trump is most certainly not part of the elite, but Trump understands that Britain is a strategic friend and ally to America. Therefore, he has to participate in any event which projects unity between the two countries. But in reality, he understands that the British establishment played a very key role in undermining his first presidency and will continue to attempt to undermine his presidency for the next 4 years. Trump is a businessman. Trump is a negotiator. Trump will meet with anyone. Indeed, by his own admission, he will meet with anyone. After all, he met with the North Korean leader, and by doing so, he was able to defuse tension on the Korean peninsula. For me, in my estimation, that was his greatest foreign policy achievement during his first tenure in power. Absolutely magnificent achievement. So, of course, Trump will meet a puppet from the British establishment or a puppet from the French establishment. And after the meeting, he will say, we had a very effective, a very candid meeting. We agree on a number of steps going forward vis-a-vis Ukraine. But these are just political, diplomatic niceties. The reality is, Lembit, is that America and Russia are now talking. And when America and Russia talk, that is how results are produced. And let me say to some people as well, who are confused by Trump saying troops would be allowed, European troops would be allowed in Ukraine, and the Russians saying they wouldn't. The Americans and the Russians resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis by means which some people would say were completely unethical and completely disrespectful. So, on behalf of the Soviet side, Cuba was a Soviet friend and ally, and yet the Russians completely sidelined the Cubans from any negotiations with the Kennedy administration. Indeed, the Russians decided to agree to withdraw ICBMs from Cuba on Cuban territory without even speaking with Castro. Likewise, the Americans agreed to the Soviet request, a secret request, to withdraw American nuclear warheads from Turkey. Turkey was a still is a friend and ally to America, but the Turks weren't even consulted by the Americans. The Americans simply withdrew their warheads from Turkey. That is how the superpowers agree on things. Whether you like it or not, they are the two most powerful countries in the world. And whether it's ethical or not, how they come to agreement, it is irrelevant. Providing the two superpowers are speaking, that is good for global peace. That is good for global stability. And I sincerely hope, Lembit, going forward, that Trump will A, purge America of the deep state, and B, he will be able to establish a good working rapport with Russia. They don't have to be the best of friends, but they can ensure that war will never break out between themselves. And also, if Russia and America stand side by side with each other, no other country in the world would dare go to war knowing that Russia and America have said to them, you will not go to war. That is why it's a problem for the British establishment. That is why it's a problem for the American establishment, because war is one of their most important of weapons, in first of all, for increasing their amount of influence and power in the world, and secondly, for increasing the vast amount of wealth that they already have.
Fascinating. Last question. You've just caused me to think this for the first time. If the United States and Russia do a deal and have a peace pact and a global understanding, perhaps with China as well, I postulate, NATO becomes irrelevant, doesn't it?
I think that with the Trump administration in power and providing Trump lays a foundation for his successors to continue purging America of the deep state, then a new beginning can emerge between America and China, even though the two countries are, economically speaking, interdependent on one another. They can't really exist without their trade with each other, without their investment with each other. But nonetheless, there is serious political and military tension there. And I believe that Trump understands that this tension has come about because of the deep state. As regards NATO, NATO demonstrated when it bombed Serbia that it is a criminal organization because it broke its own founding treaty. Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty states that NATO will never use force to resolve a dispute. Then NATO intervened in Libya and helped bring to power, or paved the way for Al-Qaeda to come to power, and as a result turned Libya into a failed state. NATO is not the Western nations, and the Western nations are most certainly not NATO. As we know, NATO was created to keep the Russians out of Europe, to keep the Germans down in Europe, to keep the Americans in Europe, and I would add, to also keep the British in Europe. After all, Germany, since 1945, has been occupied, and that explains to a great extent why so many Germans still voted for establishment parties such as CDU, SPD, and Greens, because since 1945, for 80 years, they have been brainwashed. They have been conditioned into believing that they are evil, that they should hate themselves. So whilst AfD have made tremendous progress, and I wish them luck, especially someone who is a quarter German, nonetheless, there is a big problem in Germany. Germany is occupied, and until that occupation ends, then Germany can never truly be free, and therefore Germany cannot be saved.
Thank you so much. Always fascinating to speak with you. And you put your case in a very powerful way. Marcus, we'll get you back next week, no doubt, to see how these things are developing. I'm fascinated by your take on it and rather interested to see what happens in the United States when Keir Starmer gets there in a few hours.